Our guest today is Megan Baxter, whose new memoir is called Farm Girl.
It is the story of just 1 year of my life when I was 22 and I decided to leave traditional college full time and drive back across the country to start a job as a full season organic farmer in Vermont. It is also the story of my breakup or the end of a relationship that had defined me in the years prior to this big change. A relationship that unfortunately ended with the trauma of opioid addiction and a love that I found very easily replaced by my attachment to the landscape and to the work that I sort of married myself to in Vermont.
I loved the quote. You're talking about your experiences working on a farm as a teenager. I'd begun to consider the place essential, like prayer. One of the quotes that I really like from the essayist Brian Doyle is he says that all writing is a prayer in some form. And I think he's being very liberal in his use of the word prayer. Can you talk a little bit about how farming and or writing are like prayer to you, even if it's a metaphorical prayer?
Yeah, thank you. I love that question. And I love the writing of Brian Doyle. I grew up without any sort of real religious foothold in the world and have always been trying to kind of create my own mythologies, my own reasons for being. Often, especially at the time of the book, the demands of farming, wake up, get to the farm, pick the strawberries, became the kind of schedule that was essential to me and was in some way kind of the prayer of my day. It restated every time I went to the soil, devotion to a particular task and the kind of gratefulness that I think a lot of people who are religious express through prayer. Prayer is a often a promise or something about the future, and to me, growing and being connected to a cycle that's much larger than me. So this cycle of molecules and nitrogen and water as they pass through all their different cycles in the natural world kind of form my ideas about life and death and the way in which our world is beautifully connected. So interacting with that at the farm is kind of a form of worship for me, I suppose.
Thank you. Such a beautiful answer. I think it's interesting because lots of people, I mean, most Americans are not religious. There's just a news poll comes out that it's actually under 50% for the first time, and that's only going to increase. But I think one way that people do tend to connect is when they go outside. And there's a section that I read actually that talks about this idea of seeing your place in this sort of larger world, and how interesting that is a comfort instead of, we would think the human ego would not like that, like we don't want to be small, but somehow there's a comfort there.
I think the smallness and the being able to connect to a species or a creature that is 4,000 years old, or understand the importance of an insect whose life is 3 days. When I'm outside in it, it seems undeniable that you're not the center of attention. There's just so much going on around you. And, I'm, sitting in this house and there are trees out at the edge of the pasture that are much older than me, older than the house that I'm in. And that kind of gives me context, I suppose, in framing my life.
I think of your writing as it's very lush, and it seems very, very both precise and intuitive. In the sections that I read about farming strike me as very similar. In particular, I'm remembering a scene of berries, how if you get them too early, and I love sugar, so I get this. Like, I do not want a sour berry. No. They're not right. And yet when they're right, you have to get them at just the right time. I guess it's probably your close attention to things as a farmer. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how writing and farming either support each other or are similar in your life.
Farming is about doing the same thing over and over again. Okay. And at a certain point, you start to see these big, I describe them in the book as circles, where every June is the same June. And every morning in the strawberries feels like the morning last year or 10 years ago. And that sameness, that familiarity with space is the way that I like to feel when I am in language. So being able to engage in a draft that I'm working on and intuit the syntax and my word choices and all of that. I'm an observer, particularly of natural things rather than people. And that makes its way into the imagery and the lyric in my writing as well.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of home really comes through, or home landscapes, and how,
Yeah.
I mean, you happen to be from a really beautiful place, so it's helpful. But I was born in Rochester, New York, which people don't flock to. Wetlands and marsh, and no one else is going to think cattails are gorgeous, but they do something for me, especially as I get older, because it is this landscape that seems to have imprinted itself on me.
This particular part of the world, my mother's family has been in for a really long time, and I write about this in the book, having like a family cemetery in Vermont that goes back 200 plus years. On the like personal level, seeing trees or seeing even like mushrooms and lichens that I was really close to as a kid, like brings me back to that. So I think I bring myself and my personal history into a lot of my landscape writing. Half of the book is set in the Pacific Northwest, and I did really love Portland and the coastal region there. And a lot of our metaphorical or figurative language comes from agriculture. So when we say to plow under or to grow, we're referencing something that we don't have a direct connection with, or many people don't have a direct connection with anymore. So for me, my challenge in writing this book was to be able to say things like that and not have it ring hollow, but to bring it back to its original form.
Right. So you're narrowing the space. So you're getting in there closer and touching. And what works so beautifully is, agricultural metaphors, but also the landscape. And I taught in Memphis. Many of the students like me were from the North, and some people were really open to the landscape and other people really resisted it. And what I think they're missing out on is like this whole new palette or this whole new vocabulary list that does work so well, like metaphorically, even if you're not interested in crepe myrtle trees or the Mississippi River, there's so much language that goes with it. And your book, I think your writing really is a great illustration of that.
The book jumps back and forth between two realities. One is my younger self in Portland, Oregon, reconciling my decisions about being out there and ending this relationship. And the other sections are working on the farm. And then at the end of the book, the two narratives sort of come together. This is the first chapter of the book. The cabin was everything that I hoped it would be. Remote, it pressed up against the dense forest of the Catskills and reflected by the mirror of a small pond in the front yard. It was like something out of Jaden's poetry, a dazzling little object overwhelmed by beauty. As we parked in the gravel driveway and Jaden searched under the front porch for the hidden key, I could tell from the angry thrust of his arm that he didn't see anything charming about it. When I first saw the vacation home online, it reminded me of a place from our first summer together, isolated and heady with green. I'd been overcome with a rush of memory. Back then, when we were first in love, we would have laid out on the lawn, stripped nude in the dappled sunlight, reading each other's poetry and watching hawks spin like stars in the midday sky. But those memories and those people seemed unfamiliar now. Jaden stabbed his hand blindly under the porch, fumbling for the key. Fuck, he muttered, reaching deeper into the darkness. God knows what's back there. His face was tight in a scowl as he spit out a list of potential dangers. I noticed that his body was shaking, vibrating really, like a bee in a flower. His curls hung damp and sticky against the back of his neck. Sweat pressed his t-shirt to his low back. His feet were dirty and bare as usual. Something about the dig of his toes and the dark mulch turned my stomach. He'd grown up on the beaches of Malibu and always wondered why shoes were required anywhere. He'd put on a great show every time a grocery store rejected him, throwing his hands up in shock. Right up until the spring, Jaden decided to become a poet and leave Los Angeles for an art school in Michigan. He'd been a successful child actor, In his last headshot, which I saved on my laptop, his eyes hold the camera with a sharpness that conveyed emotional authority and deep vulnerability. They were green and shot through with gold, like a cat's.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have a writing prompt for us? One that you like to teach or that has worked for you personally?
And I believe that it came out of a workshop that I was in with author Sue Silverman.
Oh.
And she writes about the voice of experience and the voice of innocence. This is particularly helpful to us when we're writing memoir, to be able to write ourselves in our younger form, whether we're 10 or 22, like I am in the book, and then the voice of the experienced writer who's shaping the text. So the prompt is really simple. It's to choose a specific scene in your life that has importance to you and write it first from the point of view of yourself in that moment, so as the child experiencing it. And then the second section is to, again, write that whole scene, but write it from the viewpoint you have now. So whatever you have gained from experience and age that changes the perspective, and see what they look like next to each other. The struggle in forming, especially long form memoir, is navigating between those two voices.
That is such a good one. Sometimes people will talk about like, well, what perspective is actually describing this? And it's never just one, right? So the exercise gets you to acknowledge that and sort of parse them out a bit. I want to see your mug again because I wasn't on the screen last time for it.
It's also just a dirty travel mug with no top on it.
No, beautiful. But I've never been able to figure out how to clink because Zoom session gets switched around. Whenever I clink like this, it doesn't work. So last time I had the guest at the Memoir Cafe clinked on the outer edge and that didn't work. I have to go to the outer and you have to go to the inner. Would you try it? So
I'm going to go to my inner.
Yes. And I'm going to go like this. And I think that's a perfect clink.
Okay.
If you like what you heard, check out the links below to learn more about Megan and to order a copy of her book. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next time at the Memoir Cafe.